I figure you guys are like my students and you like to have, things like this.
Perfect.
I don't like to hand those out because, as soon as you do, people start leaping ahead and ruining all the surprises. You should get a notes version of the PowerPoint and a back-to-back list of references. Anytime there's a reference on the slide, I've given you the actual reference so you can go. I'm sure you'll want to go out tonight and read all of them. Find out exactly where I messed up. And I see a lot of people with computers. I have no objection to you having a copy of this PowerPoint if you really, really are desperate and want it. My PhD is in experimental psychology. I taught for 26 years at a small college in Arkansas, and I taught every single student, every one of our majors, the statistics course, the research course, and the experimental psych course. So I'm pretty vested in this topic. And I thought it'd be a good topic to talk about. The first part of the title comes from where? Shakespeare, good. Hamlet, okay. And I think a lot of our students think that we're mad when we want to talk about research methods. But I think it's one of the most important things that we talk about in the whole course. And I don't really think I'm going to have to try and convince you of that point, but I'm going to maybe try to convince you a little bit and maybe give you some things that you can do to maybe slip it in a little bit. Good friend Bill Buskist, quote that I really like. I'm sure your students are just like mine. They're younger, but they don't come in expecting to hear science in psychology. And if they walk out still thinking that, I think we've not done what we should do. So not only convince them that psychology is science, but try and get them to think somewhat like scientists. And one of the interesting things I've found out in my college teaching career is that although there are, depending on what college you went to and how it's labeled, the hard sciences, the soft sciences, the natural sciences, the social sciences, or whatever, the natural sciences don't really teach a lot of research methods or statistics. I've taught statistics to a lot of biology students and nursing students and so on and so forth because they simply don't teach those kinds of things. Some of you I know teach AP, and this is what the AP psychology course guidelines look like. Do any of you ever show your students this? Okay. Because they're waiting for the abnormal and the personality and the therapy. And, just letting them know what some big body has decided this course ought to be. The research and the bio, they're usually not real thrilled about. And if you actually go and you look at the psychology course description, study skills, habits of mind, and critical thinking skills. I'm talking about research methods, but I'm going to focus an awful lot today on critical thinking because, as you're going to see throughout this, I think it's really hard to pull those two things apart when it comes to psychology. And I doubt that you can find very many colleges anywhere where people say, don't say we teach critical thinking. 2007, APA put out a document of APA guidelines for the undergraduate psychology major. You may or may not have seen this. Here they are right here. Yeah. No, let's go ahead and pass them out now. So this is a little bit like the AP Psychology course guidelines, but it's aimed at the entire psychology major. And what you'll see somewhere is this list. There are 10 guidelines, and these 5 are the ones that are specific to psychology. There are 5 more, maybe critical library, or that we're not tasked with doing ourselves, but we're supposed to help develop along with other disciplines. And of course, you see in there research methods, and you see in there critical thinking. Again, I don't think it's any accident that both of those are in there. I don't think there's any accident they're side by side. So, and this is just pulled from that booklet, if you look at goal 3, which was the critical thinking in psychology, I see research methods woven all throughout critical thinking. Respect and use critical and creative thinking, skeptical inquiry, and when possible, the scientific approach to solve problems. And if you think about it, that's one way that our discipline thinks critically. We don't run around willy-nilly, haphazardly guessing at things. Doesn't stop people on the internet from doing that, but that's not what we're supposed to be doing. And if you dig further into that, there are learning outcomes for each goal. Use critical thinking effectively, engage in creative, use reasoning to recognize, develop, defend, and criticize arguments and other persuasive appeals, approach problems effectively. Doesn't necessarily say research methods in there, but some of those things are, I think, very related. And then when you look underneath the learning outcomes, sub-goals, that's the best term I could come up for them. They don't label what those are. But again, we're in the critical thinking, the overall critical thinking goal, but look at the sub-goals that are listed there. Evaluate quality of information. Doesn't have to be research methods, but research methods is certainly one good way to get there. Evaluate behavioral claims. How do you find out if what people put out on the internet is true? Here's the latest, greatest craze to do this, that, or the other thing. How do we know? Challenge claims. Whenever I see something, hear something, TV, internet, first thing I say, where are the data? Show me some data to back up these claims you're making. Use scientific principles and evidence. Evaluate popular media reports. That's always an interesting task for students. Look at what they said in some popular outlet and then go look at the original research. It's kind of scary how well they do. And these are the science writers, usually writing these things. How do you weigh, because I think that's one thing we're bombarded with. People say A is right and other people say B is right. And sometimes both can be right, but sometimes A means not B and B means not A. How do you, when they're both saying we've got data, how do you figure that out? evidence. I talk sometimes about politics. Certainly, we're not teaching political science, but you want a wonderful example of people making all sorts of claims without any evidence whatsoever. There you go with politics. And it doesn't matter which side you favor. They're both guilty, or they're all guilty. I guess there's more than two. Evaluate the quality of solutions. There's multiple ways to attack a problem. How do we decide which one's going to be best? So again, these are all under critical thinking. But I think every single one of those fits very well with research methods. And I think that's a tool that we have that we can give students that will serve them well, not only in our class, but serve them well in their lifetime. Someday they're going to be parents, and they're going to be having to weigh these various claims. Baby Einstein. And, there's a zillion of those out there. You can go on the internet and find a whole handful. And those are good things to show students and talk about these kinds of issues. Where are the data? Remember the Mozart effect? Yeah, that was all the rage. That was all the rage. Until the research came out and said, well, it doesn't really work. But that's kind of like when you've been arrested for pandering and your arrest is on the front page and then you get, exonerated and that's buried in the small print somewhere. So, the big splashes get out there, but when the data come in and don't always support them, we don't always hear as much about it. If you've got questions or comments or whatever, weigh in, okay? I've got a concluding slide in here 3 different times. It's the same concluding slide. I don't know where I'll be when time runs out, okay? So part of it may depend upon you guys. So, if you've got questions or something to say, go ahead. Okay. It's only fair, I think, to let you know where I'm coming from. And I already told you this. I see these as being so intricately linked, it's almost impossible to separate them. And, when I agreed to do this talk, I said, yeah, I'll talk about research methods. And then I came up with a catchy title. And I said, cool. And that's one thing. If anyone ever asks you to do a talk, it's really easy to say yes. And then at some point, the day of reckoning comes. And so when I started putting this all together, I just kept coming back over and over and over again to critical thinking. And I said, why? Well, I think because of this. If a student could take in college an entire course in research methods and come out and not score higher on a critical thinking test, I'd be really, really disappointed. I'd be disappointed if they can talk about a week or 2 weeks. I don't know how much time you give to research methods, a week or 2 weeks even, and come out not being a more critical thinker. So, back to my original topic, teaching research methods can help students to think critically. And again, I think in the course, well, okay, that's a given. I've taught these things long enough to know. Students didn't sign up to learn about research methods. Students didn't sign up to learn about the history of psychology, the biological basis of behavior. But if we go back to that AP guideline, 2 of those things were in the top 8 to 10%. So we know they're important. Trying to be charitable here sometimes. And I don't really mean to pick on students, because I think all of us sometimes avoid critical thinking. And I've got a slide to talk about that later. So here's what I hope to give you some ideas about today. A stealth approach to teaching research methods and critical thinking. Presumably you will have talked about the research methods. And then later on, when you get to the stuff they're really taking the course for, you can come back and talk about research methods, not necessarily as blatantly and directly as you did when you were on that chapter or that unit. Sort of sneak it in after the fact. I was department chair at a college in Georgia for 4 years, and one of the things I got the department to think about was teaching research methods across the curriculum. You know, we talk about writing across the curriculum and things like that. And I said, research methods across the curriculum. One of the things, and it's true in an intro psych course, it's true for psychology majors, they're very good at compartmentalizing. Okay? This is that stuff I have to learn so I can get to this good stuff. And if you ever ask them, why did you have to learn that stuff over here to get to the good stuff, I'm not sure they can answer. And if they don't see the connection, then I think we've sort of fallen short of where we ought to be. So if we bring research methods back in the fun stuff, the good stuff, and let them see why those research methods are critical to knowing what we know in those other chapters. And so that was my point to the faculty in that department. When you're teaching an abnormal psych course or you're teaching a personality theories course, okay, yeah, you're getting to teach the stuff that they are really interested in and they think is fun, but if you don't let them know where that information came from, they're not really seeing the connection. And you can look, I've done this, a curriculum survey of colleges and universities in the United States. The number one and number two courses that are required of all psychology majors are stat and research. Far above anything else. Way above anything else. So, what does the literature say about critical thinking or critical thinkers? I've got about 3 slides here of various traits. Can accurately explain their decisions. Okay? Because you've thought through it. You've had to critically evaluate things, therefore you're able to explain why. Consider alternative explanations. And how quickly do people jump at the first explanation that seems to make sense, and then they're blind to any other possibilities. A lot of science has gone that way, right? They jump on a bandwagon and go halfway down the lane and before someone says, well, maybe we should look at a different approach. Your students ever react emotionally to things you talk about? You know, and as soon as you get emotional, you lose that reasoning power, that critical thinking power. I think that's why you always, at least when I was a kid, I always heard you never talk about religion, politics, or sex. Okay? Determining the truth and falsity of assumptions means you question assumptions in the first place. A lot of us, and again, I don't want to pick on just students, a lot of us have a lot of assumptions that we just sort of grew up with. I taught at a religiously affiliated school for over a quarter century. And I would talk to them about, you know, why do you go to church? And a lot of people go to church because they grew up going to church. You know, the parents said it's time to get up and go to church, and they just went. And then you look at the literature on cults, and those middle class kids, 18, 16, 20, are prime victims for cults because they've never really had to evaluate their value system, their value structure. They've just grown into these behaviors. They're just habits. They're not really values that they've critically thought about. And talking to people in a religious school about critically thinking about your religious values can get kind of dicey. I left on my own accord. They didn't find me. You know, students and people are really good at this if you mark out the word reasoned. Right? We can argue until the cows come home. But do we have reason behind our arguments? You know, this is the big bugaboo. I'm old enough that, you know, when I was in college and you went to the library and you looked up books and you looked up journals and you looked up psych abstracts in paper, you know, and computers existed somewhere, you know, in the Pentagon or somewhere. But, you know, the information that we and that our students are confronted with is just incredible. And I don't understand why, not everybody has this, but some people, oh, it's on the internet, it must be true. There's a lot of stuff out there that's not, of course. Opinion, common sense, anecdotes, appeals to authority. Sound familiar? Any of your students ever resort to that? Any of your friends, any of your colleagues ever resort to that? No one in this room, of course. Opinions from fact. Data from multiple sources. It's really hard to convince people that you need to look in more than one place to find out. Now, I teach research methods to what should be juniors in college, and their big task in that course is to do a literature review. And they'll find an article and say, well, this is it. This is, you know, this tells me everything. It's the end of the line. And I said, well, you know, that article was done in 2006, and I bet there's been articles since then about that. But it's very tempting to find one source that, of course, supports what you believe. And then your literature search is finished, right? Because they believe the same thing I do. Preconceptions about important issues. The next slide is going to be my version of critical thinking. I hope, before you leave, that you'll end up getting one of these books that says Challenging Your Preconceptions, Thinking Critically About Psychology, with some Randolph Smith as the author. So this actually comes from my book. The person who put this together looked at a bunch of different issues. But I think if we don't know where we're coming from, if we don't think about and own up to where we're coming from, we probably are deluding ourselves. We talk a lot in research about the need to avoid being biased. That's a very difficult thing to do. I always tell my students, and I wish I could find the reference to this. I need to spend some time and track it down. But there's a study out there somewhere, and it's pretty old, that went back and looked at people's data sets and redid statistics and things like that, and looked for errors in statistical calculations, because, you know, everybody can make an error in statistical calculations. And what they did when they found these errors was to categorize them as to whether the error favored the researcher's hypothesis or went against the researcher's hypothesis. Now, if statistical errors are random, half ought to favor and half ought to disfavor. Well, what they found out was 2/3 of the errors favored the researcher's hypotheses. Now, were they cheating? Were they being blatantly unethical? We hope not. But it is very difficult to really be truly unbiased and know all those preconceptions that you're holding. And then that leads into understanding the use and abuse of statistical information. This comes from Busquist and Irons, and again, you've got these references. A lot of these references that I'm using, especially the 2008 ones, come from this book, which is Teaching Critical Thinking in Psychology, a Handbook of Best Practices. There's a annual conference that the Society for the Teaching of Psychology puts on called Best Practices. And one year it was about critical thinking. And there's some really good articles in there. So notice how many of those traits resonate with knowledge, skills, aptitudes, and values gained through research training. And that's one thing we don't talk about a lot, are the values that we're trying to inculcate when we talk about research. But if you go back and you look at those, a lot of those are values, aren't they? I value my ability to do these things. Even sometimes when it's stupid stuff that doesn't matter one iota, like a television commercial. But when you have your research methods / critical thinking hat on, you find yourself, or I find myself, yelling at the TV. That's stupid. Come on. There wasn't really a study that showed that. Now, it's all these claims that people throw out there.
Or the morning talk show host.
Yeah. Oh gosh, yes. 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 They're some of the worst. Your students have a lot of those traits or values that were on that list? And again, not picking on students. I don't think we live in a society that values critical thinking a whole lot, which is kind of scary, given everything that's going on around us. But I think these are not necessarily behaviors and traits and values that come naturally. I think they're things we have to work at. I've worked at it long enough that usually it comes through. But there are times when I will fall prey to something. So, if you get this book, well, you will, right? It was shipped overnight from California on Friday. Apparently overnight doesn't mean Monday. He said it might be Tuesday or Wednesday. So, but inside here are characteristics of critical thinkers. One thing about critical thinking is it's not always comfortable. I can go into class and I can talk about this long theoretical argument between this position and this position, and sometimes the students will just be sitting there, you know. Why aren't you taking notes? Well, I want to know which one's right. Yeah, or which one's on the test. But, you know, which theory is right? We don't know which theory is right necessarily. And sometimes we come into a really interesting situation where two theories are right. I can't come up with, well, I can come up with one example, but color vision. You know, you've got the trichromatic and the opponent process, and it certainly makes sense that one of those is going to be right and one of those is going to be wrong. But it turns out they're both right, just at different places in the nervous system. So, you know, I think that's an interesting place to pull in something about research and critical thinking to your students. You know, tell them, if you're sitting there looking, thinking the whole world's black and white, right and wrong, that's not always going to work out. Okay, the inherent biases and assumptions, that's our preconceptions that we're carrying with us. When I'm up here in this area of the country, I talk funny. In Texas, I talk normal and other people talk funny. Skepticism. This is one I think that sometimes you got to worry about a little bit, because you know some people who've taken this one and they've turned it into their mantra. You know, they don't believe anything. They're skeptical about everything. But I would say a healthy air of skepticism. Asking people to provide you with evidence or data, I don't think is going overboard. Some of them may, but facts from opinions. People argue politics like it's facts. Don't they? There are some facts in politics. They get obscured by politicians, but again, this goes back, I think, to that black and white, right or wrong sort of view of the world. A lot of people, will just want a tunnel vision and don't bother me with all those other sorts of things. Teaching people how to make inferences and have those inferences be logical, that's a hard job. Hard job. I don't think we can do it in one course, but we can certainly try to model it for them. At least introduce them to it surely they've seen it before. But I'm not sure I'm picking on students, and when I say I'm not, that's who we're responsible for. Do they understand what logic really is? Is jumping to a conclusion logical? Depends on the data, depends on the evidence. Examine the evidence that's out there before you draw conclusions. That seems pretty obvious, pretty self-evident, but doesn't mean that that's what people always do. Okay, now notice how many of that list also fit knowledge, skills, aptitudes, and values gained through research. A lot of those are just, someone asked me to write this critical thinking book to go along with an intro psych book, and I wrote what I think is like a research methods version of critical thinking. Okay. Same conclusion, different list of traits. And values. I come back to values. I'm sure you guys are really big into assessment in your jobs, right? Everybody has to assess. We started talking about assessment way back when it first started coming. It was like assessment of knowledge. What do they know? But now it's gone beyond just what do you know. What can you do? What do you have the potential to do? And what do you value? Because the scary thing about knowledge is how quickly it can dissipate. There's studies out there that look at retention of material a few months, semester, whatever, after students have taken an intro psych course in college. And it doesn't take them long to get down to the level of knowledge of someone off the street. But in a sense, I hate to say this, in a sense you can argue that might be okay because knowledge does change over time. Facts change. I can't give you a specific example, but I know as long as I've been teaching, I was teaching things way back when that were facts then that aren't now. You remember McConnell's planaria study? Where he trained the planaria to turn one way and they ground them up and fed them to the naive planaria. Oh, lo and behold, they learned more quickly because they had, we're talking about some sort of chemical, molecular, or whatever basis of memory. And I know that was in one of the intro books I taught from very early on. Well, what happened over time? Nobody could replicate it. And McConnell's planaria study I still use as an example. when I teach research methods of how knowledge changes over time. So here's a big idea. Maybe. There we go. And this is what I meant a few minutes ago when I said, I don't think I always critically think. You think of state versus trait personality theories, okay? Anxiety, for some people, is a trait. If you're an anxious person, you tend to be more anxious than normal people all the time, then you've got the personality trait of anxiety. But things happen to you in your life that raise your level of anxiety temporarily, like giving a talk in front of a bunch of people. Okay? That's a state. That's a temporary sort of thing. So, although I like to think I'm a critical thinker, I'm going to lapse in and out of it. I have to be consciously aware. I have to try and intentionally do these sorts of things. Now, I hope my state is more frequent than my students. But, you know, as soon as you start thinking of yourself as I'm always a critical thinker, something's going to happen. Bob Cialdini has a book called Influence. There's a quote-unquote scientific version of it and a popular press version of it. And I don't remember, I may have read both of them, I don't remember. But Cialdini is one of the world's foremost leading authorities on influence. And to write this book, he actually went through car salesman school or training or whatever. I hate car salesmen. You know, it's like dealing with yourself because they know so many tricks. But in writing about influence, and Cialdini has done a lot of research on foot in the door and door in the face and all that sort of thing. And he talks about those, and then he says how he's walking down the street and this Cub Scout or Boy Scout comes up to him and wants to sell him some chocolate bars. Or tickets to something else, or what, you know, and he says, I bought a couple of chocolate bars for $2. I hate chocolate. He walks away and says, I just fell victim to this. You know, so the fact that we can critically think does not always make us critical thinkers. And we need to keep our, you know, our shields or our radars or whatever up to make sure that we're not taken in. But I think if we approach it this way too, it gives us a way to work with our students and say, you know, let's try and move this state to be more frequent rather than less frequent. And this slide came from my good friend Jane Hallinan, who's got a chapter in that critical thinking book. And she says, by knocking students cognitively off balance, they'll engage in critical thinking to restore their balance. Sounds like one of those old balance sorts of theories. And she gave an example. You mentioned the morning show hosts. She had her TV on one morning before she was going to school to teach, and the people were talking about, I don't know if this is the proper term for it. I've never heard this term. Sagging, wearing your pants at half-mast or lower than half-mast.
Below the mast?
Yeah. And the newscaster or the person said, the lower the pants, the lower the IQ. Now, if you're like me, that sure fits with my preconceptions. But, you know, she brought that into class. And I'm guessing with college students, you've got some people in there, you know, who engage in that practice and certainly wouldn't react well to that statement. But trying to get them, Jane has got several books and things on critical thinking, trying to get them to critically think, let's not react to this emotionally, which if you were a sagger, you probably would. Or if you were anti-sagging, you might, yeah, that's right. But let's think about this. And could you turn that into a research project? Certainly, I'm assuming, we wouldn't think that pulling your pants down has a cause and effect relationship, would we? So obviously, but the way that was worded, it almost sounds causative, doesn't it? As opposed to correlational. And when I teach my students in research methods, they've come through a statistics course, usually the semester right before, and we get to correlation. And I say, well, what do you remember about correlation? Correlation does not imply causation. They can spout that until the cows come home. But can they see it in the real world? If you can't apply that, you're not really thinking critically. You're not really using that research sort of thing. So there are things that come out all the time in the newspaper, on TV, on the internet, that you could probably use to knock students cognitively off balance. And then do some good role modeling after that. Don't get angry about this, or don't, react in that way. What could we do with that statement from a research point of view? So, I mentioned several slides ago about a stealth approach. And so, I'm going to give you some very specific, concrete examples, some you might be familiar with even. If you want to use this one, there's a lot of disclaimers in here, which I'll try to make clear. So, if you look up attachment therapy, of course, one of the things you might find is Bowlby's attachment theory. Remember how kids are securely attached or that sort of thing. Okay, this is not that. This is something called attachment therapy, which is used to treat attachment disorders. Typically with foster kids or adopted children, because they may not be attached to the adoptive parents, the caregivers, or whoever is there. And allegedly, they've got suppressed rage, and that prevents them from becoming attached. The suppressed rage is due to their past maltreatment, abandonment, and all that sort of thing. Okay? Now, this is a good example, and I'm not at all necessarily picking on these ideas at this point. This is a good example of how almost everybody who develops a theory couches it in terms and words and thinking that seems very logical. I mean, this seems very logical that this could happen. There's actually a DSM diagnosis coming up in a few minutes. So, it's not like this is totally made up or anything. Okay, how do you deal with these attachment disorders? Well, the most common approach is called holding therapy. The therapist or the parents firmly hold or lay on the child. And the idea is to get some of this suppressed rage to come out and to achieve catharsis, which, interestingly enough, is an example I'll give you later about a concept that everybody knows. I mean, I think a lot of your students know catharsis before they even come to class. They may not know the word, but they know if they scream and yell or break things or whatever, it makes them feel better. The interesting thing about catharsis is the data do not actually support catharsis. So we've got a questionable concept packaged inside something that at least has potential for problems. So the goal is to reduce the child to this infantile state, and then you can reparent the child. And so you're going to rock, cradle, bottle feed, force the kid to look at you. And this is, again, the goal is to get the kid to bond with you if you're the foster parent, the adoptive parent, or whatever. Okay? So that's the context for this. And again, to promote attachment. All sounds very logical. Okay? If you look, you won't find any scientific validation for this idea. It's not based on attachment theory. As I said, it's not Bowlby's ideas. It's potentially abusive. It has been labeled as pseudoscientific. And case study, actually there are multiple case studies. This is the one with which I was familiar, at least to some extent. Candace Newmaker, who was removed from her home as a child. Her parents had their rights terminated at age 5. She was adopted at 7. And within months, her adoptive mother took her to see a psychiatrist because of her behavior and attitude at home. She wasn't, shaping up. She wasn't showing affection and those sorts of things. Okay? This is real. This is in DSM-4-TR, reactive attachment disorder. So, one of the things about any these kinds of things we're talking about, there's usually grains of truth scattered throughout them. This is not totally off the wall. So her mother took her to Colorado when she was 10 to undergo a 2-week intensive attachment therapy session. She was referred by a licensed psychologist in North Carolina. Okay, so she's been seen by a psychiatrist and she's been referred by a licensed psychologist. Presumably not quacks. Okay, rebirthing is kind of like attachment theory, attachment therapy. You've got to be careful because there is apparently a fairly legitimate rebirthing set of ideas. This one was not. Okay, so they wrapped her in a sheet to simulate being in the womb, and she's told to get out of this, to be born, the rebirthing, and so she can, be reduced to that infantile state and attached with the mother. Okay? However, the therapist, two what do they call them, adoptive parent surrogates or something, and the stepmother, birth's not an easy task, so they made this birth a difficult thing by preventing her from getting out of the flannel blanket very easily. This was all taped. Okay, so people have seen the tapes. Okay, you can tell this is getting into a desperate situation. So clearly this is going on a long period of time. She's had her fill of this. And yeah. It was a big deal on the news at the time. Somewhere around 2000, I think, if I remember right. Now, what happened? As I said, there were two therapists. They both got 16-year prison sentences. Therapeutic foster parents, that's a term I couldn't remember. 10 years of probation and 1,000 hours of community service. The adoptive mother, 4 years of probation. Colorado and North Carolina, the the event took place in Colorado. She came from North Carolina. They passed laws labeled with her name, as we often do with abused kids and things like that. And I think it was CSI and Law and Order or something ended up having episodes about this. Okay? Now, sorry for the downer. But, what are the lessons? Okay? As I said, it's scientifically unvalidated. How many people are out there offering therapy that might not seem like this? But remember those 2 slides of stuff that seemed kind of logical about attachment therapy. It didn't seem like absolute hokum. Yeah?
What's missing here is I'm guessing there must be some sort of desperation from the parents that make it really hard to divorce yourself from these things, or I'm desperate as a child.
Certainly.
And so I get it, of course.
Yeah.
But as a parent myself, sometimes you're like, gee,
Mhm.
I tried all these things.
Right.
And you know what? This doesn't seem to hurt. Let me just do this.
Right.
I mean, it's obviously
Yeah.
pretty extreme, but
Yeah.
that's
It is a very difficult call. There's no question about that. But I think what I would say, or what I would hope I would say, is where are the data that support this as a scientific approach? And the example I use a lot with my students is when you go to your family doctor, you don't expect him or her to say, oh, I got these new pills over here. I don't know if they're any good. There's no data, right? You don't expect that stuff. But people seem a little bit more willing when we talk about therapy to start, getting away from what I would like to think of as more mainstream. And yeah, no, there were probably no data before this that said this is going to kill someone, but and they're going to give you testimonials. Oh yeah, this brought this kid together with the parents, and I know the vast majority of people out there wouldn't know to ask about where your clinical double-blinded trials kinds of things, but I think more people would know that about medicine, wouldn't they? Critical thinking to me would be apply the same standards to this that you would to your medical doctor. Yeah.
I think it's even more important, the critical thinking piece is because often you don't know the correct question to ask.
Right. Right.
So in critical thinking, you keep saying, I gotta ask something.
Mm-hmm.
As opposed to, I don't know what to ask, so I'm just gonna go with it.
Right. Yeah.
And that's where people get hung up, both in the
Yeah.
medical field and in the psychology field, is that I don't know what to ask, so I'm just gonna assume that the experts know what they're doing.
Yeah. One of the things I've seen in a few intro texts, I don't know how widespread it is, but if they have little boxes or little things at the end of the chapters, I've seen some where I want to say it's at the end of the therapy chapter. It might be the stress and coping chapter, but what kinds of questions should you ask a therapist? Because people don't have a clue. I think for a lot of people, going to a therapist is like going to a witch doctor. Going to chant over you and rub some bones and sacrifice a chicken, and maybe you'll be better. Yeah.
I think as teachers, and I'm going to say this honestly, over 33 years I've seen this happen, that is a definite area where we are subjected to scientific, quote unquote, but unvalidated research on how to teach.
Right.
And seriously now, my kids,
Oh yeah. How many workshops have you sat through with,
And you know what? One of the biggest problems that psychologists have with some of the educational research is just that. It's not scientifically validated, it hasn't been proven. And one area that every teacher in this room knows about that psychologists will say is not validated is learning styles.
Mm-hmm. Yep.
No, I know that.
Yeah.
We went with it for a while.
Oh yeah.
UBD, then learning styles, now we're on to...
Mm-hmm.
And all of the material that they hand out
Yeah.
at these least they all have the byline
Yeah.
and the date next to it, so many of us critical thinkers look at it and say, oh, it's got a reference, so it must be right.
Yeah.
But it's the author of the program.
Right.
And
And that's,
so,
you know, you have to be really careful about that.
And you know, I don't know how you do your in-service workshops and stuff like that, but there are people that make very good livings going around the country presenting stuff like that. And they don't, well, I'm not going to say they don't care whether it's validated or not.
It's just
Yeah.
in the point.
They believe in it, therefore it must be true. It's that preconception sort of thing. Try convincing your school counselor or your principal or whatever that learning styles, you know, the data don't really support it.
But it's also a good lesson for us in the difference between qualitative and quantitative data.
Right.
Because, you know, psychologists tend to like quantitative data more, and we have, you know, different types of research that we do. Active, you know, research in education is very different than research in psychology, and it's not that it's all bad, you know, and there's good things that people have learned about relative to learning styles and teaching styles that have made them better teachers.
Mhm.
It's not all bad, but it's something that we need to be aware of.
Yeah. Yeah, there's certainly a lot to be said for not standing up and just talking for 50 solid minutes. So if it's scientifically unvalidated, there's no supporting research. And this is the key. This is the key. The fact that there are no data does not lessen people's belief in these things. It's like arguing with that door. You know, that's a big problem for us. And it's personal experience trumps scientific evidence, which I'm going to get to maybe if I have time. An absence of critical thinking. And again, remember, go back to those first two slides, it sounds very logical. And that's one of the problems. When things sound really stupid, it's easy to critically think and to dismiss them. But when things seem logical, and as you said, if a parent's desperate, and I remember those desperate nights and, you know, yeah. Where are the proof? What are the supporting data? I don't think those are ever bad questions to ask. I think those are bad questions to go unasked. If you want to volunteer for a clinical trial in medicine, you get informed consent, you get everything out the wazoo, because they can't give you the proof. They can't give you the supporting data. They've got some hints, some indications from the lab or whatever, and this works with animals or, you know, whatever. But in medicine, you're fully informed when you're not getting something they know will work. Okay, this is what I was referring to. Smith and Vasquez, again out of the Critical Thinking book, talk about the persuasive power of personal experience. And you see this all the time in teaching intro psych, don't you? Oh, well, my grandmother or my cousin, right? All these examples of things, and they don't fit exactly, and you know, when you tell students, well, we're talking about general principles, they kind of get disappointed because, oh, this isn't going to work 100% of the time in all people, under all circumstances, every time. No, it's not. But you know, one of the things we're starting to find out too is some of those things we thought were absolute laws in natural science aren't always absolute laws. I mean, look, every time, well, I guess they don't send up the space shuttle anymore, but every time they send up the space shuttle, you know, they sent up experiments to see how these things would, you know, some like 5th or 6th graders sent up crickets to see how they would, you know, and spider webs and weightlessness and things like that. There are conditions under which natural laws don't always hold. So why is the burden of proof on us, you know, really higher than it should be for other disciplines? Remember Hallinan big idea. Critical thinking could be a state, not a trait. So when you lapse into your personal experience, you know, you're out of the state probably of critical thinking. And students are pretty good at learning lessons when we make them really concrete and really applied. One of the examples that Smith and Vasquez talked about is when you teach statistics and you go over a new statistical idea or formula or something, and you give students homework, they go home and they reliably, religiously apply that formula to those problems, and they work them pretty well, and oh, I understand this stuff. And then you give them a test where there's all this stuff mixed together and it's not clear. Oh, these problems went with day 14, you know, all of a sudden it's like, I don't have a clue what's going on anymore. So sometimes we learn things only in a given context. And maybe I critically think about what my doctor tells me, or maybe I critically think about this or that or the other, but I don't do it in other contexts. Now, you know, in terms of thinking about critical thinking as a state, it needs to be a state. I don't think you want to critically think about every decision you make in your life. I do when I go to the store and I see the generic here for $1 less. I pick it up and I compare the ingredients to the name brand, and I see they're the same, and I put the name brand back. I don't know if that qualifies as critical thinking. But, you know, I'm not going to sit there and debate out of all the different toothpastes, you know, which one am I going to choose? Or every time I buy bath soap, or et cetera, et cetera. So some contexts it's okay. When I go buy a car, I probably better use some critical thinking. I don't want to be like the 16-year-old girl who says, oh, that car goes great with my eyes. Sorry for offending any 16-year-old girls in the audience. Carey and Smith wrote about a common sense epistemology. And the idea that they were trying to get across here was that this common sense epistemology arises from our sensory experiences. And so knowledge is simply a collection of many true beliefs. The problem with that is that the beliefs are then not organized into any sort of framework that we might think of as theories or, you know, collections of ideas or things such as that. And therefore, their personal belief obviously is part of their common sense epistemology, and there's no need to check or evaluate their personal beliefs. And that's one of the things we run into in teaching psych. We're not dealing with a lot of concepts. I mean, some of them certainly are, but a lot of the things we talk about are things that students do have personal experience with. And if all we do is teach students to get the right answer on the test and then revert back to their common sense beliefs, you know, we haven't really changed them. But it's hard to undo this. It's really hard to undo. If we were teaching nuclear physics, on the other hand, not many of our students would walk in knowing a lot about nuclear physics. Our students know a lot about behavior. Unfortunately, a lot of what they know is wrong, or, you know, it's based on an anecdote or my grandmother and things like that. Scott Lilienfeld has done a lot of writing. He doesn't really always label it critical thinking, but he does a lot of pseudoscience sorts of things. He is a clinical psychologist, and that's going to be relevant in just a minute. He talks about naive realism, which is erroneous belief the world is exactly as we see it. Again, my personal experience, my personal journey trumps everything else. So sometimes we tell students things and they just don't believe us because it doesn't match their experience. So they may be pretty big on this seeing is believing, or what you see is what you get. And Lilienfeld and his colleagues applied this to psychotherapy, which gets a little bit back to that notion of attachment therapy. And this is not necessarily our students, but he teaches at Emory or Georgia Tech, I can't remember, and is training clinical graduate students. And there's a bias that therapy is going to work. Therapy is going to be helpful. Or at least it's going to be harmless. And what's the worst you can do? Not get any benefit. Well, as we saw with Candace, that's not the worst you can do. So if psychotherapy works is part of your preconception, your mindset, why do we need to bother with research? Can't we just see people getting better and validate it that way, if we even think of the need to validate? And so he very specifically points about trainees, and he's talking about clinical trainees. And that's the notion of I see them getting better. And you go through your errors in thinking, we're talking confirmation bias, out the wazoo. They gave a really good list of 10 reasons why ineffective psychotherapies might seem to work. Okay, initial misdiagnosis, maybe someone was experiencing just an episode or an episodic version of this, but was diagnosed as chronic. You think of depression that might be linked to one specific event as opposed to being clinically depressed all the time. There's a big difference there. Okay? The person who is going through an episode is certainly going to show improvement pretty quickly. But if you thought it was not episodic but chronic, something that's ineffective could actually seem to work. Spontaneous remission, we know that people get better on their own. Any good clinical study will have a wait-listed control group. So there's a group of people who say, I need therapy, and they say, we're full right now, we can't see you for 6 weeks, because we need to see what happens to people who don't receive therapy for 6 weeks. And your students will often say, well, that's cruel, that's mean, that's withholding treatment. In clinical trials, aren't there placebo groups? Yeah, there has to be a control group, or else we're not doing good research. And the assumption that we're being cruel means we're assuming the therapy is going to work, which is our question we should be trying to ask. Is the therapy going to work? You see, when it becomes this cycle. Regression to the mean, nice statistical term, right? When do people call? When do people say, I need therapy? When they're at the very worst. Okay, what's going to happen? They're going to get better just because it can't get worse. Which might not be the therapy, of course. Multiple treatment interference, this is a classic. If we're doing research, we manipulate only one variable at a time, right? So if the person's seeing you for therapy and they're taking vitamins and, holistic this and that and the other, who knows what actually works. Selective attrition, people do drop out. The people who tend to drop out more according to the clinical literature, are the more impaired people. Okay? So in other words, the better people stay, and therefore more likely to get better anyway. A placebo effect. This was something I didn't know. I mean, I know about placebo effect. But according to Lilienfeld and colleagues, 40 to 60% of people report feeling better between the phone call and the first session. Just the fact that they're going to go for therapy starts some sort of process going. Obviously, that's a placebo. Novelty effect. Something's going on, it's new, it's different, I'm feeling better. Demand characteristics, just like in experimental research, clients will report what they think the therapist wants to hear, especially if you feel a bond, a connection. Effort justification, kind of like cognitive dissonance. I'm spending all this money, I'm taking off work, I'm doing all these things for therapy, so it must be helpful. I must feel better. Yeah. How stupid would I be to spend this money if it didn't make me better? Retrospective rewriting, there's no real change, but their version of how bad they were when they first started may end up changing. So this is another example, I think, of stealth sorts of things when we talk about therapy. How do we know therapy works? Because I hope students are not interested in therapy that know if it works. And here are some reasons why what you think is therapy you can really not actually do. So, as I pointed out again and again, what we're seeing is research kinds of problems more than anything else. And perhaps not thinking critically. Because if you're a therapist, you want to believe what you're doing is helping. Some mixed news here. This is a study where they looked at undergraduates majoring in social sciences, natural sciences, and humanities. They gave them a test at the first and the last semesters of college, so approximately 4 years' work. They measured them on some of the problems with statistical and methodological principles, some involved conditional logic. And good news, for statistical and methodological reasoning, social science majors and psychology majors showed very large percentage gains compared to natural science and humanities students. Not surprisingly, what they found was there was a high correlation in the gain scores with the number of statistical courses they taken. And not surprising that humanities students might not take that courses, as I mentioned earlier, natural science students don't necessarily get as much sales as a lot of people think. The not so good news on conditional reasoning, and this barely shows, that's actually negative. Minimal. But what they found here was the correlation was with the number of math courses. Math and computer science, but when they looked at statistics again, the computer science was essentially confounded with math. So math was the big deal here. So, I say all the time in my department now that the students I hate to see come in my office, the department chair, who have to sign a form allowing them to change their major to psych, are those students who come and say, I really don't like math and science, so I want to be a psych major. And I have to talk to them.
As a result of that, in your department, have they required some math and, science as a result of that?
We, in our Bachelor of Science degree, which is like 95% of our students, they have to take 2 semesters of 2 different sciences. And they have to take more math than the university requires. Our SAT course in the department counts as a university math course. We don't allow it to count that. They have to take 2 math courses plus our SAT course.
What about the BA?
So we're trying to work, on this problem, so to not have math. The BA is
Just a minimal math.
1 science, but they still have to take 2 math courses because they're going to take our SAT course. They still have to take our SAT course. So we want them. They have to have college algebra with a C or better before they can take our SAT course. So even the non-psych majors have had a course before they take our SAT course. Now the interesting thing was that Layman and Nisbet linked statistical methodological reasoning to the ability to critically think. They weren't as distressed about the logic sort of thing. Logic seems like logical thought was more mathematical kinds of logic. Okay. This is my first concluding slide, and this is probably where I better conclude. I think this one's fairly self-evident, but we want to avoid poor thinking, bad thinking, whatever. Critical thinking is absolutely necessary. It's not just absolutely necessary for the course we teach. And that's, again, one of my things that I think psych majors get. It helps them a lot. Whether they go on to grad school in psych or not, they're going to be able to think, we hope, better than some of their peers. Research methods is a concrete way, I think, to get into critical thinking. Critical thinking is a tough thing to teach. I mean, if you had students in front of you and you said, I'm going to teach you how to think critically, where would you start? So, concrete research methods concepts are not things that students typically stumble over and say, oh, I don't understand that. That's so, I can't wrap my head around that sort of thing. They don't like it, but they don't think the material is all that hard. When you explain extraneous variables and confounding and how we don't know if men and women are different because of heredity or environment, that's not rocket science to understand. But that's to be able to understand that and then think about it in bigger terms and in other contexts, I think it's pretty important. And so I think if we don't teach research methods, we're pandering to students because they don't like it, and we're shortchanging them because they're not getting what they ought to get. So, we're pretty much out of time. Craig, has door prize?
We do.
Somebody has door prize?
We do have door prizes.
To help you with your methodological thinking, psychologist perspective and introduction to research and psychology. Some Smith guy is a co-author. I hope the